Welcome to this edition of the Patrick Coffin Show. Before I say one more word, I want to address you and maybe someone you love whose life is being ruined by porn. If you're trying to stop looking at porn and you can't seem to do it, or maybe your spouse is, maybe there's a problem with one of your kids and you want protection down to zero usage, go to covenanteyes.com. That's covenanteyes.com. Use my name, Patrick, as a keyword coupon in the checkout. You get 30 days to try out this bad boy. All the devices in the Coffin home have Covenant Eyes. It's not just blocker for software, it's accountability. So every single page, every word combination, and every possible conflagration of triple X terms and sites goes to a third-party website. It's a fantastic, I would say product, but it's really a lifestyle. So again, covenanteyes.com. My name, Patrick, is the coupon code that gives you 30 days for free. I think you'll love it. Nice segue to the topic. Every once in a while, a book comes along that puts a lot of important ideas into one place. And the book we're going to be talking about today, and the author, Mary Eberstadt, connects so many dots about the reason why I started Coffin Nation. About a year ago, I made the statement that a few years before that, it felt like we were galloping toward the abyss. Well, now in 2019, as we record this, it feels like the abyss is galloping toward us. Transgender, identity politics, rage on campuses, the isolation, dislocation caused by so-called internet communities. Where did it all start? How do we get back to normal? What is normal? Is normal just a setting on the dryer? Our guest is Mary Eberstadt, and she'll be here in about 7 seconds. Don't go away. As promised, Mary Eberstadt is a former research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She's the author of a number of books you need to read. I'll mention two of them. How the West Really Lost God, a new theory of secularization, and The Loser Letters, a comic tale of life, death, and atheism, which is now a stage play. Her latest book is brand new. You must get this book. People, it's called Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. I'll try not to get too fanboy here, Mary, but thank you for spending time. I'm glad you came on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Patrick.
Primal Screams, you get to the last page of the book where you really flesh out what you mean by that, this cri de coeur we see amongst especially young people. What was the inciting incident that made you sit down and pound out this fine book?
Well, I've been working for some years now, piece by piece, analyzing the impact of the sexual revolution. And this is the closing piece. This is about its effects on politics. And what prompted it was something very unusual. In 2017, a notable liberal, Mark Lilla, a professor at Columbia University, wrote a short book attacking identity politics. Mm-hmm. Called The Once and Future Liberal. And what was fascinating, in addition to the book, which was an attack from the left, what happened afterwards, there was a great deal of vituperation aimed at him from progressives and other liberals. And it had a surreal quality. It was very unhinged and emotional and irrational. And watching this reaction, I started thinking, there's more to identity politics than meets the eye. And I started digging because I thought it was important to get at the real fundament of where this panic about identity is coming from. Because whether you look left or right, or you look to sexual identitarians, racial identitarians, etc., this question, who am I, has become the most pressing question of our time. Why is that? That's a very strange phenomenon. So in writing the book, page by page, I was trying to get at the root cause of this thing.
Having a little volume issue, Mary, if you can speak up just a little bit.
Sure.
That would be great. My first book is called The Contraception Deception, and I locate the Great Truce of 1968 as a big watershed. That was sort of a cultural, moral, sexual Rubicon that was crossed. Of course, it had begun to be crossed in 1930 when the Anglicans gave us contraception in the Lambeth decision. But it seems to me that, as you've written in your book on Adam and Eve and the pill, the removal of conception and the adventure of parenthood from sexual unity, there's an inexorable logic to that. Once you disassemble those two fundamental building blocks, it's a matter of time before your logic catches up with you. So, of course, if so-called safe sex is a possibility, then you're going to need a safety net. Well, that's called abortion. And down the road, you're going to have to redefine what privacy means. And eventually, you end up in the swamp of confusion known as transgender, dysphoria, identity politics. It's all. It seems to me to represent isolationism and dislocation from each other, the breakdown of the family. I mean, I sound like, moral majority cliche here, but the breakdown of the family is also at the heart of this mix, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is something that it's very important for us to understand and for the people watching to understand, Patrick. At every step of the way, beginning with the approval of the birth control pill, conservatives and moral traditionalists raised their hands and said, there's something terrible that's going to come of this. And every step of the way, of course, polite society laughed them down. And for the most part, it seems like the Catholic Church and others have been on the losing side of the argument. But look at where we are now. And these are the kind of factors that I'm examining in the book. We have an explosion of loneliness among the elderly, but not only among the elderly. If you Google loneliness studies and any Western nation, you will see that sociologists are spending a lot of time talking about the isolation of the elderly. And it's epidemic. In Japan at this point, something like 4,000 people die every week, isolated. They die alone. Mm-hmm. And this phenomenon is sweeping the Western world. Where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from the social experiment that's been running for 60 years now, in which families are smaller, families are childless. A lot of people are going through life without brothers, cousins, mothers, fathers, etc. And we had no idea when this started how it was going to end up, but we're starting to see it now. There's also an epidemic of loneliness among the young. A study came out just the other week about this. Why are they lonely? Again, let's get to the root cause of this. Let's talk about how half of young people don't have their biological father in the house. Let's talk about how a lot of young people don't have siblings or cousins or extended family in any meaningful sense. It's very important to emphasize this because the Catholic Church has gotten a bad rap for sticking up for families. And anyone who's questioned the sexual revolution in any way has been, kicked out of polite society. But the trends in our world today really are disturbing, is putting it mildly, and they're all coming from the same place. They're all coming from the unthinking embrace of the sexual revolution.
You've got several different chapters, and they all start with the word gone. Parents gone, siblings gone, basically God gone. The sibling one really made me think about the experience of growing up with siblings. You have a common understanding of who you are because you know whose you are. You belong to mom and dad. And when there's very few of them, and especially, let's say you have two, I have a sister 4 years my junior, but I grew up sort of, I guess, existentially as an only child because I didn't have a twin. I didn't have brothers my age I could, play sports with and stuff like that. And my sister was in a different kind of universe. And so if you don't grow up in a large family where there's a lot of holy chaos and a lot of forced sharing, right, then your view of the world and your view of marriage and family is going to be likewise colored by that experience of isolation in your own home because you're not surrounded by a community of like-minded kids who belong to the same mom and dad.
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of sociology about the benefits of having siblings. It's widely ignored, but readers find references in my footnotes to all of that. And I also threw in references to the animal kingdom because in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of research into animal behavior. And it's very interesting stuff, Patrick.
Yeah, we think of lone wolf. Bzzz. There's the first myth that goes. Tell us about why did you start with wolves and then the lone wolf myth?
Because it turns out that there is no such thing as the lone wolf. And if you look at studies on wolves, it turns out that they are intensely familial animals. They live in nuclear families and they live in extended families. And this also turns out to be true across the animal kingdom. Every mammal and beyond mammals, animals live in families. And when those families are disrupted, the animals develop serious problems. There's been a lot of research on this. Let me just mention one example: elephants.
Mm-hmm.
Elephants will rampage and otherwise get destructive if there isn't an older bull elephant nearby. And the way that you stop them from doing this is to put such an elephant in their midst. There are a lot of other pieces of suggestive evidence that show we are really the only species at this point that is trying to live in defiance of our nature. Why do animals live in families? For lots of reasons. For protection, in order to know who they are. In the normal scheme of things, animals don't have dominance fights. Those fights develop when the family structure is disturbed. Why is it, Patrick? We can see this clearly enough when it comes to other species, but we can't turn the mirror toward ourselves. A lot of what I describe in the book that's emerging from animal research is pertinent to our situation. There's just great resistance to seeing it.
Aristotle said we're animals, although rational animals. It's funny how the left especially will use the animal kingdom in a selective cherry-picking way when it validates their own moral agenda. They say, look, monkeys, look this, that, and the other, but they don't look at this through the lens that you're treating it with. I was thinking, you mentioned early on, and you returned to it, the hashtag #MeToo movement, and the rise of the internet culture as a way of providing a faux family, a kind of substitute community. I mean, Facebook has definitely defined friendship way down. And I've wondered why it's not called the him too movement, because Me Too is I'm also a victim. So there's this community of people who've been harmed by perpetrator. I wondered in a different era, if you had an outbreak of similar predatory behavior, if it would be called him too, pointing at the perpetrator and not, I don't want to say wallowing, but not focusing on the victim status. Because victim status is huge now, especially perceived victim status in college campuses. It's almost a superpower.
I zeroed in on the Me Too movement for two reasons. Because I think both of them prove that we should take a jaundiced view of the sexual revolution. The first reason is this: why are these predatory men just assuming that all of these women are sexually available? Now, I'm not trying to, thrash out who's right and who's wrong in any given case. We'll let, courts take care of that. My point is something different. It is that when you read about these cases where there's been serial predation, whatever gave these men the idea that they could do this with impunity? This gets back to the imploding family. Part of the answer, I think, is that a lot of these women don't have brothers, fathers, uncles, protective figures in their lives. I started going through the Me Too stories looking for that. Mm-hmm. And it was exceedingly rare, Patrick. It was amazingly rare, in fact. So again, women are in harm's way because they have a reduced circle of men to whom they can appeal in a non-sexual way, in a familial way. So that's one point about Me Too. But there's another point, which is, I think Me Too reveals a vast breakdown in social communication. And it gets back to the fact that we crushed the petri dish through which the sexes learn about each other in the first place, and that is the family. Mm-hmm. How do women learn what men are about? How do men learn what women are about? Well, if you're fortunate enough to have siblings of the opposite sex and parents whose marriage is intact and a robust extended family, that's how you learn. But these women, many of them seem to have been just sent out into the paid workplace with no protective coloration whatsoever. They haven't been told, for example, don't go to your boss's hotel room at night, and just basic self-protective
Yeah.
things. And men don't know what women are about in many cases, and women don't know what men are about. And why is that? Because they're not learning the way that all the generations before us learned.
So the father in this elephant example would be the strong bull elephant who keeps order. And if someone's considering going off the reservation or becoming violent or whatever, that becomes the presence of stability, if not implied paternal threat of punishment. Take the father out and you take away that essential guardrail. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And of course, we'll be accused of defending the patriarchy for talking in terms like that.
Guilty as charged, properly understood.
Underneath it all, underneath all the noise about the patriarchy, let's talk about the patriarchy. What I'm trying to get at in this book is the authentic pathos out there. And that's something that I think the right has missed about identity politics. There really is a great well of sadness that's coming through in these cries to identify with this group and that group. But the left doesn't understand this either. The left thinks the problem is the patriarchy or some abstraction. No, there has been a very real injury, or millions of injuries that have been going on since the sexual revolution started. People really are suffering out there. They just need to understand what they're suffering from. And abstractions aren't going to get us anywhere.
Is that part of the thesis of the Bruce Bauer book, The Victim's Revolution? Great subtitle, The Rise of Identity Studies and the Closing of the Liberal Mind.
Yes, that's not exactly his thesis, but that's a very useful book. And in Primal Screams, I cite several examples of books that have come before that I think have gotten a piece of the truth. What he manages to capture very well is the irrationalism of identity politics. Look at the language in which it's expressed. Look at what happens on campuses when students duct tape their mouths shut or stomp around, chanting monosyllabically. This is unhinged behavior. You can understand why people mock it because it seems so surreal. But we shouldn't be mocking it. We should be trying to understand why they feel so injured that this is the only way they can express themselves in these infantile, pre-rational sorts of ways.
Noisemakers, threats. You put in one spot in the chapter called The Conversation So Far and Its Limitations. Christina Hoff Sommers, Charles Murray, Heather McDonald, my friend Milo Yiannopoulos, you could add to that Ben Shapiro. When people come on campuses to express ideas that might be challenging, and universities are supposed to be bastions of free exchange of ideas, the ultraviolence is real and damages are real, and people, they just completely melt down. Irrational is the right word, but it's also irrationality fuel injected with rage. That's the troubling part.
Yes, and again, I'm trying to get to the source of that because this is something new. There's long been a left and a right and sort of policy debates, but this kind of collective delusion and collective acting out is something new. And you can see, if you look at the footage of some of these demonstrations or walkouts on speakers, you can see that the rage is real. And you can also see a panic there because people need to cling to these identity groups because they don't know who they are apart from these groups. And that's what's driving identity politics. That's what makes it the headline that won't go away.
Maybe the apotheosis of that is the phenomenon of children of sperm vendors. I've stopped calling them donors because they're not missionaries, they're paid. So the children of sperm vendors, you cite, my daddy's name is Donor. There's a whole community called Anonymous Us. And that is a very troubling reality, to not know, to know that you will never know unless by some miracle the Father himself tracks you down, who the source of your existence is. The mom may have had you and kept you, but that paternal source of your origin, your very being, is completely fractured. And it's like, in a way, the phenomenon of growing up in a divorce situation to the nth degree. where the father literally only wanted to do one thing, and that was provide semen samples so that someone could make some money.
This is why I think the example of the donor children is important. There has been one serious study of what happens when there's anonymous sperm donation, and it shows exactly what anyone with common sense would expect it to show. These kids, and now some adults, want to know who they are. How do they try to answer that question? They go to 23andMe and sources like that and go and find out who they are related to. This has become a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it teaches us something, Patrick. It teaches us that when we want to know who we are, we look first to the people we are related to. So in this sad example of these kids who will never know their biological father, we see our own human condition in a microcosmic form.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that 23andMe would likely not have an appeal as a thing, say pre-1965, but now there's an almost, probably hasn't risen to obsession, but a great interest in one's past. Where were my people from? From whom have I emerged? Am I Norwegian? Am I a Bedouin? Almost like as a pendulum swing, since in the present I'm not really sure who I am, but 23andMe will tell me who I am by linking me with another tribe, a tribe maybe I didn't know it existed, to whom I can belong.
I think that's exactly the appeal of those commercial firms, for sure, is that people don't know the answer to that question, and they're desperate to reconstruct an extended family for themselves.
Mm-hmm. One work you cite, and I've seen it a lot in various bibliographies, and I'd love to connect with him, is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone account. Now, I understand that Professor Putnam's from Harvard, more or less a man from the left, certainly not a moral traditionalist, has spotted this phenomenon, Bowling Alone. It's a wonderful title, and you can almost see it reflected in the word apartment, the rise of the apartment. The isolation involved in living in close proximity to thousands of people but never meeting them. Why did you mine his wisdom? Tell us a little bit more about the thesis of Bowling Alone.
Yes, well, it's a very important book that tells us a lot about how we got here. Bowling Alone is about the diminution of associations, as the title suggests, even down to bowling leagues, associations that once brought people together and don't do so anymore. And you can throw church into that list as well.
Mm-hmm.
The rise of the nuns, which is often discussed these days, is really about one more form of association that's diminishing in the United States. And so this kind of diminishing has also had an effect on knowing who we are. Am I a member of the book club? Am I a member of the gardening club? Do I volunteer at church? If I don't do any of those things, those are three more things that I don't have to define myself. So Putnam set the backdrop. What I'm trying to do in this book is look at the very most elemental association of all, which is the family, and to see what wreaking havoc with it has done to our sense of identity.
I'm going to put a study that I didn't see in your book, but I think it bears mentioning, and that's a study of suicides that found, this is within the last 10 years, the thousands of women who were seriously Catholic in their orientation, were regular churchgoers and went to Mass throughout the week, had a 0% suicide rate. And so this is an intro to a question I want to ask you about the internet. And I'm not sure if you've heard of the Werther effect. It's this psychiatric reality based on the Goethe novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, in which the protagonist of the story is jilted by his intended. She dumps him, and he kills himself with a handgun. When that came out in the late 18th century, there was a spate of copycat suicides where young men who were jilted had that book on their person and shot themselves successfully. And the internet taps into this by making heroes of mass shooters, by repeating the crime over and over again, if it's a shooter or whether it's a high-profile suicide. And people can, if they're on the edge, see this media saturation with this terrible sorrow, and it becomes a point of attraction. On the other hand, there's an opposing thing called the, what's it called? The Geppetto. No, it'll come to me. It's from the magic flute. What's it called? The Papageno Effect. And that is when someone who's overcome a terrible tragedy or has endured a long time with a serious disability, and that story gets out, it also has an encouraging effect on people who are tempted to despair. Seeing someone in like straits who succeeds and overcomes is a very powerful thing too. So this is a long-winded way of saying, do you think the internet has helped or hindered this elemental cohesion of the family and a society that's healthy because its members have clubs and unions and so on and guilds to which we can belong? So internet, thumbs up or thumbs down on that score?
Pretty much thumbs down, because virtual communities will never substitute for the real thing. And I think the reason people cling to them online is just that they're not getting enough of real community in real life. There's no doubt that the internet has a lot to do with what's ailing America these days. But on the other hand, it is not the fundamental source of the problem. And the reason I say that is that identity politics predates the internet. Sociologists and other scholars all agree that identity politics started in 1977 with a manifesto put out by a group of African American feminists. And 1977 is well before the internet. 1977 is when the first generation to have been born into the sexual revolution was coming of age. And the document that these feminists put out is a very sad document. Basically, it says, we are banding together because we know the only people who can work for our liberation are us. So right there, you have a statement that's jarring and unusual by human standards. What do they mean that the only people they have are each other? Don't they have families who have their backs? It's an early statement, and I think a harbinger of what was coming next for everybody else, because the answer is that a lot of people who seek out these group identifications are doing so because they don't feel like people have their backs anywhere else.
And so my highest good is to belong to this one identity tag marker community. This is my tribe, my clique, no matter how small. And to me, just hearing you answer just now, it made me think, if all you have is white, and just flip the color, if all you think you are is a white guy, you don't know who you are. You're lost. Whiteness is meaningless as a concept, as an identity. You know, let's say pre-1977, you had Irish and Lithuanian and German and Canadian and Swede and Norwegian. You didn't have white. White is a very postmodern concept and not at all helpful.
I agree with that, Patrick, and this is what I'm trying to get at. You could say, well, look, Mary, this is depressing stuff. You know, why would you write a book about this? But the answer is, we are not going to get better without the right diagnosis. And if we think the problem and the root of our dividedness is somehow an abstraction like whiteness or patriarchy or intersectionality, if we think that's the problem, we are not going to get better. We need to name the animals and then put our heads together about what to do.
Could you say better a true uncertainty than a false certainty?
I suppose.
Well, yeah, I agree. There has to be some strong lie, L-Y-E, and let's say a diagnosis of cancer is terrible to hear, but unless you think it's something else, then you can excise it early and understand its relationship to the whole. In reading this book, I was thinking about St. Paul's vision of the church, not as a me and Jesus kind of silo where I've got this vital hidden connection with my Savior, but the body of Christ. We are members of him and of each other. And on page 58, you say, who am I? Religion has traditionally supplied, I am a child of God. Now there's the only transcendent grounding to one's identity, because it goes beyond family, it goes beyond ethnic background, it goes beyond skin color, it goes beyond DNA, right?
Yes, and the loss of that answer is a big part of the problem out there. You know, I get into some of the statistics about the rise in psychiatric problems among young people and the rise in anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. This is not only because of the family implosion, although that's the most obvious thing to look at. It's also the case that if you don't think you're a child of God, then you're rootless, and also you do not have in common with your fellow man what Christians think we have in common, because child of God is not the only familial language that the church uses. Mm-hmm. We are taught to treat each other as brothers and sisters, for example, as figurative brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
If you're not part of a religious tradition that emphasizes these familial elements, you're all the more adrift without these things. And so I think secularization is not only hurting us in the obvious ways, you know, like reduction in charitable enterprises and, you know, things like that. Mm-hmm. It's also hurting us at this, you know, more primordial plane, where people are losing the ability to navigate as brothers and sisters, or as I put it in the book, you know, this might be the most sexually experienced generation in history post-revolution. But it's also arguably the most sexually illiterate, because people do not have as much non-sexual, safe, if you will, experience of the opposite sex. And that includes because they're not finding brothers and sisters in church.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is another dot connection here, because one way to understand the church is that it's the family of God. And families use language like brother and sister and father and mother. But if your personal experience of family is either painful or non-existent, you can't quite warm up to those terms. And so that may help explain the rise of the nuns, because the church is answering questions nobody's asking. It's presenting a solution that people can't get their arms around. They can't connect with them. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. I actually wrote about this in a previous book, How the West Really Lost God, which I see as a companion piece to this new book, Primal Screams. Because How the West Really Lost God looked at the effects of the sexual revolution on the churches. And what I do is tie the rise of the sexual revolution to the rise of secularization. And for the reason you just cited, if you live in a world, say the only experience you have of a father is your mom's boyfriend, you know, and it might not be a very good experience, then it's going to be harder for you to make a conceptual leap to the idea of a benevolent God as father. Mm-hmm. So these things are a two-way street. And when we take away the familial model, it leaves us less capable of understanding Christianity, and also leaves us with the problems that I talk about in Primal Screams.
You mentioned the prophet P.D. Eastman, one of my favorite authors growing up. Are You My Mother? Often mistaken falsely for Dr. Seuss. The little bird going from the snort to, the bird falls out of the nest, and it's not until he answers the question, "Are you my mother?" that gets correctly answered. That's when the bird knows who he is. That cracked me up seeing that in your book, Mary. Apropos. I'm trying to find the section where you mention, oh, here it is. Yeah. The hottest boy band in China is a bunch of androgynous girls. And you go through lyrics from Tupac Shakur to Eminem. So much of I call it sorrow rock or glum rock, it's all about the dislocation because of an absent father. and the confusion and the loneliness and the longing for some permanence and the admission, the de facto tacit admission that I'm messed up because I came from a fractured background. They don't even hide it.
Yeah, the signs are all around us of the damage of the sexual revolution. There's just a great deal of resistance to seeing it. Now, in the matter of androgyny, there is a chapter in the book, as you know, where I argue that one of the consequences of the revolution is that men and women, for different reasons, have both been forced toward androgyny. And I think this is a really important point because one of the phenomena of our time that most people find really hard to explain is, what is all this gender stuff about? Why are people so confused about who they are that way? Doesn't DNA answer that question? But I think there are reasons why there's confusion about masculinity and femininity and man and woman. Let's just take one. Boys grow up today in, about half of cases without a biological father in the home. And psychologically, what is the meaning of that? Now, mom may be heroic. I happen to think any single mother is heroic. So this is not about mom. Mm-hmm. But boys in our society can't help getting the message that men are bad. And I think this subliminal message to boys, we have the phrase toxic masculinity, for instance. Where did that come from?
Formerly known as masculinity.
Yes, exactly. And it's coming from exactly what I'm describing here. So the system, as it were, ends up rewarding boys for being more feminine, and for different reasons, rewarding girls for being more masculine. And that's what I unpack in that chapter. So we have a drift toward an androgynous meme.
You can see this maybe 60s and 70s epitomized by people like David Bowie, whom you mentioned. There's a new biopic coming out called Stardust about David Bowie, following on the heels of other propagandistic films like Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man. They seem to not be able to find heterosexual rock stars to make movies about. But in your view, androgyny is a kind of survival strategy then?
Yes. I think androgyny is a survival strategy for a wildly changed ecosystem. That's what we're talking about here. And I also think feminism is a survival strategy of sorts. Mm-hmm. Feminists don't see it that way. But if you listen to contemporary feminism, if you listen to its anger, its belligerence, its coarseness, its swear words, underneath all of that, I think, is something, again, that's desperate. I think this kind of swaggering, tough attitude is compensation for a world in which they don't have men in their lives who could assume that same, traditional role. And so they take it on themselves. They know that the world has become a more dangerous place for women after the sexual revolution. They may not know it consciously, but they know it at some level. And so this belligerence and this kind of strutting, that we see with modern feminism, for example, think about the resistance and its march on Washington after President Trump was elected. Mm-hmm. And you remember those pink hats, and you remember the shouting.
Yeah, all the worst features of men, ironically adapted.
Exactly. It is ironic, but I think that's where it's coming from. And again, what I'm trying to do with this argument, Patrick, is get us out of the culture wars, not because there isn't a right and wrong about all of that, but because we need to understand the brokenness out there and the sadness out there if we're going to do anything about it.
This all sounds very reminiscent of Marshall McLuhan, who focused on understanding media and its hidden effects rather than just lead with finger pointing and moralizing. Because there's perhaps two ways to understand what the term culture war means. On the one hand, some people take it to mean I'm fighting against other people because I don't like them and I want to be right, versus it's a war over which culture we're going to have. Which culture do we believe makes it more likely for someone growing up in it to be stronger, loving, and good? And I'm in the latter team. So,
yeah, we do have to understand the metaphysical dimension of this as well, which is that it's not the case that there's one religion out there. There is a competitor to Christianity that secularism has thrown up. It is a competitive set of beliefs that is grounded in the primacy of the sexual revolution. It puts sexual pleasure first, and it has its own sort of imitation of Christianity. It's got people who are, the equivalent of saints, like Margaret Sanger. No matter how many times anybody points out that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist and a racist, it never registers on the other side. I mean, Planned Parenthood used to give away, I think still may, these awards that are called Maggies, which are monetary awards for journalists who have done a super good job encouraging abortion.
Yeah.
So, this substitute religion is something that we have to understand, because it's also part of why people on the other side fight so ferociously on these culture issues. It's because they have a religious understanding of them, whether they're conscious of that or not.
Right. So many directions to go with that. Do you believe that second wave feminism, 60s and 70s, was a reaction against broken fathers and men who were failures?
Yes, I think that's exactly where feminism came from in the first place. And again, we see it in that document that I mentioned earlier, the Combahee River Collective Statement, the founding document of identity politics. 1977 is when the first group of feminists are explicitly giving up on men. That's what that document means.
Right. Yeah, this idea of a parallel religion, this is something I point out in the Contraception Deception. The new false god seems to me to be the sterilized orgasm, in which this idea of sex without babies has prophets. Margaret Sanger, I guess, would be one of the Old Testament prophets in the sense of coming beforehand. The prophet Howard Stern, the prophet Hugh Hefner. He has an evangelical revival called the Sexual Revolution. It has a creed called the Playboy Philosophy. It has sacraments, right? Adultery, masturbation, pornography. You mentioned pornography in another context, Mary. I wanted to ask you why you believe that porn today will be seen in the future as tobacco is, understood as something seemingly good, and people hide its bad effects, but in the end, the truth will no longer be able to be hidden.
Yeah, it's interesting, Patrick. It used to be that there were feminists who attacked pornography, and that is no more. Right now, a culture that is guided by this substitute religion just gives it a green light, and nobody is supposed to say anything about it. But I think that consensus that this stuff is benign is going to change, and what's going to change it is science. What's going to change it are the growing number of therapists who are treating kids, boys, young boys, who've never kissed a girl, who have a pornography problem. Mm-hmm. Lawsuits will come of that.
Right.
It's very interesting because we do have ways of regulating companies that put out addictive substances. That's what the example of tobacco proved. It took a long time. It took decades of haranguing and being shouted down. But that changed the social consensus about tobacco smoking. There's no question about it. And it changed it all over the world. At some point, people entertained the idea that this stuff caused harm. And I think that that's going to be true of pornography because it, too, is an addictive substance. And I think more generally, it's going to be true of what I'm describing in this book, because we're doing damage to ourselves. The substitute creed that we've been talking about has been effectively in charge of our culture for some time now.
Mm-hmm.
And the results aren't good. The results look like decline in life expectancy for the first time in recorded history in the United States, and rising psychiatric problems that not just arise due to better diagnosing. All the experts agree that they're seeing a lot more problems in kids and in college kids than have ever been seen before. So, the other side may seem to have the upper hand, but the record is not a good one for them. And sooner or later, they're going to have to engage it.
What do you think about the proposition that couples who don't have sterilized sex, who value large families, will win demographically over time, where the left are, if you have more than 2 kids, someone's going to start staring at you. I call them the fertility police. Whereas large families, the future belongs to them.
Yeah, that gets back to an argument that the sociologist Eric Kaufman made some years ago. It was a very smart argument, and it was called "Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?" And what he was getting at was what he called the Iron Law of Demography, which is that religious people have more children. No matter what religion you're talking about, the more religious you are, the more children you have. And I thought that was kind of fascinating. That actually prompted me to write How the West Really Lost God, because I thought, well, what if we flip the causality around? Maybe it's not that they're having bigger families because they're religious. Maybe something about living in these bigger families with more experience of humanity is making them more religious.
That's interesting. Hard to tease out which is the cause and which is the effect.
Yeah, I called it a double helix, meaning something that needs both sides, to support each other. But it does apply across history. I mean, societies that are robust in a religious sense are societies, generally speaking, that are robust in a familial sense.
3 years ago, I reached out to a tweety, unknown professor of psychology in Toronto named Jordan B. Peterson. This is long before his book. And what drew my attention to Jordan was a headline in the CBC. U of T prof says I'm not a bigot. So that got my interest. And back then, he was fighting the crazy pronoun wars on the campus there. People who want je and ze and she and all of the nutty pronouns. Nowadays, I mean, it's almost quaint how 2015 that was, because now we have actors and actresses. You can't, all female actresses are now called actors. Ms. is commonplace. You can't say miss, because that implies, I don't know, sexual availability or ownership. Mrs. certainly has got to go, because that's submission. What's the end game here? You have boys who think they're girls, who are competing in things like track and field and wrestling, where serious brain injuries are now starting to happen because they have an enormous natural advantage because they're boys that think they're girls. When is this all going to collapse, Mary? And the curtain will be parted and we can see the guy running the Wizard of Oz flames.
Well, here's what I'd like to zero in on for a minute, and that is what this tells us. So, in the insistence that I will get my own pronouns, that I will have something that's mine, that's independent of the English language and grammar and everything, it will be mine, all mine.
Yep.
This is what I'm talking about, Patrick. This is why identity politics is pre-rational, because look at that language, look at that insistence. That is about the kind of psychology that toddlers have. Yeah, and I mean that with empathy, because I think this underwrites all of identity politics. So, for example, the white nationalists who talk about wanting an ethno-state, that's mine. And people who have such a problem with cultural appropriation. Now, I want to stipulate here that there are real grievances in the world, and that I completely understand why Native Americans don't want their sacred objects, misused in the public square for decoration or something like that. There are legitimate grievances. But most of identity politics is not about those. It's about saying, that thing is mine. You can't appropriate that taco. That's mine. And, down to the littlest detail. So in this frantic insistence that this is mine and you can't have it, whether it's about language or whether it's about these cultural signifiers, it all comes down to the same thing, which is people who are frantic, who are grabbing onto anything they can to find out who they are and what is theirs.
And that's transmogrified into a malignant narcissism of a toddler temper tantrum.
Well, it sounds more like language that comes from toddlers than it does language that comes from adults. And I think there's a reason for it, which is that at some level, people are frozen into being unable to become adults because of the damage out there. Mm-hmm. And I should say, too, to people who are thinking, well, my family's okay, my family's robust, or, I'm part of the counterculture, that's all great, but we are social creatures. And if there is enough damage to our habitat, as the left likes to say, mm-hmm. That's going to be communicated, and it's going to rub off on others around us. And that, I think, is what's happening, too. There's a generalized feeling across American society that things are not working out, whether it's the American dream or the opioid crisis or, just the list of problems that we can all agree on. Mm-hmm. Where is this apprehension coming from? And I think it's coming from, again, this fundamental fact that we are not living the way we as social animals are meant to live. And that's having repercussions. It's having repercussions on people who are still trying to do that thing. And it's just, disseminating throughout the water, really. Mm-hmm.
Mary, where can people connect with you? Do you have a website? What's the closest distance between a listener and you for speaking, for anything?
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, the website is maryeberstadt.com, and the book is Primal Screams.
I'm going to show it one more time to the camera for our Coffin Nation members. Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Before I let you go, Mary, I want to remind people we are going to Germany next year, and you are coming. We're just going to take one bus. Catholic Bavaria. We're going to be in the church where little Joseph Ratzinger was baptized. We're going to hear about his whole rise to become Pope Benedict XVI. We're going to see the Passion Play at Oberammergau. We're going to go to Salzburg, Austria to see where The Sound of Music was filmed. And our spiritual director is Father Willie Raymond, who's running the campaign for the canonization cause, I should say, of Venerable Father Patrick Peyton. So here's how to connect with that. patrickcoffin.media/pilgrimage. This is a bucket list event. I really would love to have you join us. patrickcoffin.media/pilgrimage. Mary Eberstadt, thank you so much for your work, for this fine book. Keep cranking them out. I'm a huge fan, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Patrick. It's always great to talk to you.
All right. Godspeed. All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.